So it's morel season, and everybody's trying to find these little guys. Everybody wants to know where they are and what are the best places to forage for them. And with a little practice, it becomes relatively easy to find these guys. I know many times they seem obscure, hidden in this little patch of grass or something along these lines, and you think, how could I ever make rhyme or reason in terms of how I'm going to get to forage these guys regularly? Well, I want to share with you a guide that's going to help you locate these things every morel season around April and May without a whole heck of a lot of difficulty. And one of the things that I discovered is that there are two biomes in particular that I'm going to mention in this video that will help you find morels regularly. And that is abandoned apple orchards, as you're seeing here, and tulip trees in wild forests. So stick around, and we're gonna break this video into two parts that's gonna help you find these morels. In future videos, I'm gonna teach you how to clone morels and how to preserve these specimens. Potentially, you can seed morels into other areas where you find tulip trees or elm trees or ash trees, etc. And hopefully this video will be educational for you guys. Every year, around the first few weeks of spring, mycology enthusiasts and foragers in my area, that is the northeastern United States, and frankly the world over, begin their hunt for the elusive morel mushroom. These rare, highly prized mushrooms are coveted for their delectable taste, and due to their mycorrhizal nature, they are very, very hard to cultivate on a commercial scale. Now, morels, although rare and elusive, do have certain environmental conditions that they favor. The tips that a novice morel hunter usually encounters when researching where to find morels and starting out are to focus your search predominantly around elm, ash, and tulip trees. And throughout the years, I took this advice and became well acquainted with tulip trees and their long, straight trunks and their distinctive leaf shape and the distinctive flowers that they drop in the spring. And I searched for ash trees, with their diamond-shaped, rough bark and their distinct leaflets that have many individual leaflets per leaf. And of course, the American elm with its characteristic non-symmetrical leaf. I listened to all the other tips and tricks as well. I concentrated on south-facing slopes in the beginning of the season, and I waited until soil temperatures had maintained themselves at around at least 50 degrees for a period of a week, etc., etc. Now, morels are believed to be at least facultatively mycorrhizal, and thus the exact chemical cocktail needed for them to fruit is not completely understood, but it is obvious that these tree species possess something in their root structure that lends itself to the conditions the morels need to grow. And these previously mentioned tips are all sound tips for finding morels, but the habitat I have most consistently benefited from in my search for these elusive fungi has been the abandoned apple orchards of the American Northeast. I have found that in apple orchards that have been abandoned with high concentrations of dying apple trees, morels are most likely to be found. And there's much debate currently, again, over whether or not morels possess the ability to be both mycorrhizal and saprotrophic at different stages in their development. But it is my completely layman and non-peer-reviewed belief that if in fact morels have these dual mycorrhizal and saprotrophic properties, then something about the trees in the dying apple orchards that coincide and are interspersed with dead trees, dead apple orchard trees, something about this particular combination helps to cultivate the precise environment that morels prefer. And this, again, I want to stress, is a completely unscientific hypothesis on my part, but visiting these abandoned apple orchards to test my hypothesis has, at the very least, given me the fortune to have perennial access to morels every season, year after year. But it should be noted that I do not consume the morels I find at these orchards. I think it's extremely important for several reasons to choose defunct apple orchards that are no longer being farmed if you do in fact wish to consume your foraged morels. The most relevant reason of which is the fact that few operational orchards do not use some type of pesticide and fungicide on their apple trees, and for obvious reasons, the use of fungicide means no morels. But the second and just as important reason is simply that the use of pesticides on apple trees may have an adverse effect on the chemical compositions of any morels that do grow under them, rendering them not fit for consumption. So I think that it's important, if I'm recommending, after all, to people watching this to go forage for morels in defunct apple orchards, that they know the risks surrounding the consumption of these morels. And that is that during the late 1800s to about the 1940s and 50s, the use of the chemical pesticide lead arsenate was used widely, specifically on apple orchards, to combat pests such as the codling moth. And by the late 1940s, many of these pests had developed resistance to lead arsenate and calcium arsenate, and other synthetic compounds had begun to displace inorganic chemicals as pesticides. So it is not yet known to what degree edible fungi hyperaccumulate lead and arsenic, and while mycoremediation can potentially be used to remove toxins from the soil, those fruiting bodies, when they are morels and any other edible mushroom, can potentially carry those toxins within their fruiting bodies. Now, with respect to this park, Peach Hill Park, I should note that the levels of both lead and arsenic have been tested and deemed to be acceptable levels. But my hope is simply that at some point, and this is why I'm sharing this location with you, that at some point, trained and amateur mycologists, with permission of the park officials, descend on here during morel season, forage these potentially contaminated morels, and clone mycelium from these morels in order to inoculate other areas conducive to morel growth in hopes of preserving these morel genetics and biodiversity. Now, it should be noted that not all apple orchards are the same in this regard. And in order to understand how this complex relationship between the American apple orchard and the elusive morel mushroom came to be, you have to understand that there are 4 major epochs of American apple orchard establishment and cultivation in the United States that we should learn about. And the first one of these eras that we should discuss can be roughly placed at the beginning of the 17th century with the establishment of what we call the, quote, farm orchard, which were very distinct from the organized and much more robust orchards of the 1800s. American colonists did not plant apples with the same intent that we do in our modern-day orchards. The primary purpose for growing apples was for feeding their animals and for the production of cider, for drinking, and as well as for barter. So as a result, since overly sweet apples weren't required for the production of cider, you had a myriad of different apple species proliferate, but most of them were not very palatable in the traditional sense, in the way that we know an apple to be palatable. And because in this era, farmers were much more likely to use seedlings instead of grafts to plant apple trees. These orchards sprang up with absolutely no organized geometry. The only pest control and fertilizer used on these farm orchards were that of the resident animals on the farm that of course fertilized the farm with their waste and kept pests at bay by eating them. And these farm animals, because of the way they foraged, they like to forage low-hanging leaves, in turn created apple trees with tall, unbranched trunks. So the lack of organized geometry and trunk structure that these conditions created much more resembled a traditional forest than the orchards to come in the 18th and 19th centuries would. And it is these farm orchards that have most effectively been recolonized by nature while having virtually no contamination from pesticides. Now, in the late 1700s, many private American speculators were anticipating significant settlement into the Northwest Territories. And in the state of Ohio, for example, the Ohio Company of Associates offered potential settlers land grants under the conditions that in a span of 3 years, they would be required to plant 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees. And so this too, in part, added to the proliferation of the farm orchard. So again, these particular apple orchards, these farm orchards, are prime morel foraging spots and where I believe your foraging efforts should be concentrated in the majority. One important thing to note is that because seedlings were used as the primary method of growing orchards during this period, it was of natural consequence that these species proliferated and became naturalized in the surrounding ecosystems and not just in their apple orchard area, which further contributed again to the proliferation of the wild American apple tree, which for our purposes are just as ideal environments for foraging morels as your modern day geometrically spaced, potentially pesticide-laden apple orchards are, where morels also grow. By the beginning of the 19th century, The farm orchards, while still ubiquitous, were being slowly supplanted by the first commercial orchards. The first original American literary work of horticulture was Bernard McMahon's, quote, American Gardener's Calendar, written in 1806, where he criticized the unstructured and unpruned nature of most American farm orchards. And alongside this literary work, which advocated for pruning and grafting and other more advanced methods of apple cultivation, the discovery of one apple variety with characteristics that were ideal for organized commercial growing emerged in the Americas. And this apple variety, known as the Ben Davis variety, was more resilient in the cold American winters. It started bearing fruit at a much younger age than most of the farm orchard seedling varieties, which usually took a decade to begin fruiting. The Ben Davis apple grew later in the spring, and it was also much more resistant to bruising than its predecessors. So these factors gave rise to the first commercial orchards. And fast forwarding to the 20th century, from the period of about 1900 to 1980, about 49 million pounds of lead arsenate and 18 million pounds of calcium arsenate were applied to soils, orchards, and other crops in the state of New Jersey alone. And similar rates of pollution proliferated in all states that had a significant amount of commercial apple orchards. These millions of acres sprayed with lead arsenate represent, in our country's history, the single largest anthropogenic input of arsenic. Not just in our country's history, but in, I believe, world history. So in 2007, a Mr. Robert Peabody, who was an expert amateur mycologist and longtime member of the New Jersey Mycological Association, was diagnosed with a severe case of heavy metal poisoning. And his case made headlines when the medical team that treated him attributed his condition to the consumption of Morchella esculenta, that is morel mushrooms, which he had collected for decades in abandoned New Jersey apple orchards. And this is one of the first instances of poisoning from morels foraged from pesticide-laden apple orchards. The problem of lead and arsenic contamination in apple orchards previously treated with lead arsenate pesticides received a much higher amount of public attention with the famous case of the Barbara orchard. And in 2001, the 500-acre former commercial orchard west of Waynesville, North Carolina, was declared a Superfund site. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, which is the federal government's program to clean uncontrolled hazardous waste sites in the United States. In 1999 and 2000, following reports of numerous birth defects amongst the population residing near this orchard, along with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, conducted a $4 million emergency removal of a foot of topsoil from the yards of 28 residents at the Barbara orchard in 2001. Needless to say, the fact that it took a total of $4 million to clean the residences of only 28 residents begins to put into perspective the size and scope of this problem. But specifically for our purposes, we wish to know the quality of the morels in these orchards. It is important to know to what degree these morels mycoremediate these toxins. Do they uptake these toxins to a point that renders them dangerous to consume, or are they relatively safe? In a study conducted by Eleanor and Efrat Shavit, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, apologies. In a study conducted by these two persons on the concentration on lead and arsenic in the fruiting bodies of morels in these contaminated apple orchards, 29 paired samples of soil and Morchella esculenta fruiting bodies were collected from abandoned apple orchards that were potentially contaminated with lead arsenate pesticides in the northeastern United States. And soil and fruit body samples were tested for lead and arsenic content using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. So I'll skip over a lot of the scientific jargon here and try to condense the methodology and results into as short a summary as I can here. But in short, it says that, quote, to determine the form of arsenic present, speciation analysis of arsenic was performed on one sample of Morchella esculenta, and 94% of the arsenic stored in the tissues of the mushroom was found to be in inorganic form. The ranges of lead and arsenic found in the soil were 19.2 to 2,450 milligrams per kilogram and 3.08 to 244 milligrams per kilogram respectively. And the ranges of lead and arsenic in the Morchella esculenta samples were 0.05 to 13 milligrams per kilogram and 0.15 to 2.85 milligrams per kilogram, respectively. And this is the interesting bit here. It says statistically significant positive correlations were found between the amount of lead in the mushrooms and the amount of lead in the soil, and the amount of arsenic in the mushrooms and the amount of arsenic in the soil, and the amount of lead and arsenic in the soil. And this is the interesting bit here. Statistically significant positive correlations were found between the amount of lead in the mushroom and the amount of lead in the soil, as well as the amount of arsenic in the mushroom and the amount of arsenic in the soil, and the amount of lead and arsenic in the soil. While the levels of arsenic in Morchella esculenta did not exceed regulatory safety standards for acute duration oral intake of inorganic arsenic, some did exceed standards for chronic duration oral intake of inorganic arsenic. The levels of lead in Morchella esculenta from contaminated apple orchards were sufficiently elevated to pose potential health risks. And it also mentions here in the study that the new Special Pesticide Task Force in New Jersey found that measurements of arsenic and lead between different orchards varied considerably, and even, this is important, within the same orchard, arsenic levels varied by a factor of 10 or more. And this is because most insecticides are sprayed on the canopy of the trees, allowing the excess to drip to the ground, and most of the accumulations of arsenic and lead measured in the orchard soils follow the tree drip lines, forming donut-shaped areas of elevated contamination around the trees. Morchella esculenta is traditionally collected year after year in the potentially toxic drip lines around dying apple trees. And this is perhaps because the drip line is typically the limit of the root extensions upon which Morchella esculenta are thought to depend. And there is evidence that Morchella esculenta is, quote, facultatively mycorrhizal and has both saprotrophic and mycorrhizal properties. Apart from forming associations with the apple trees, Morel mycelium is also capable of decomposing organic matter on its own. And lastly, it goes on to say, the most striking results to come out of this study are the levels of lead found in the Morel fruit bodies and the magnitude of the correlation between the lead in the soil and the lead in the fruit bodies of Morchella esculenta. Based on the R2 value of 0.88 displayed under Figure 2, we can determine the amount of lead in the soil is a good predictor of the amount of lead in mushroom fruit bodies. This R2 value indicates that 88% of the variation in the amount of lead found in the tissues of the mushrooms can be explained by the amount of lead found in the soil from which they grew. These results are disturbing. We considered the provisional tolerable total intake of levels, that is the PTTIL, for lead set by the FDA in 1993, taking into account the tolerable daily intake levels have not been set because no quantity of lead is considered safe for consumption. The lead content of 90% of our samples of Morchella esculenta exceeded the PTTIL for children 6 years and older, that is 6 micrograms a day. 69% exceeded the PTTIL for children 7 years and younger, that is 15 micrograms a day. 59% exceeded the PTTIL for pregnant women, that is 25 micrograms a day, and 28% exceeded the PTTIL for all other adults, and that is 75 micrograms per day. So up to 28% exceeded the PTTIL for all adults. And this is why I believe that morels foraged from these apple orchards should be studied and not eaten and consumed in any way. Again, there exists high variations in contamination levels in different parts of these apple orchards, within them, as well as without. And even if one area is tested and shown to be acceptable, you really don't know about the other areas. So these morels, in my opinion, should be found, pursued for the thrill of the hunt, and then preserved for science and not consumed. Now, if you insist on consuming morels from these potentially tainted apple orchards, no one's going to stop you, and you're free to do so. But what I humbly suggest is taking these morels and either sending them to amateur mycologists that can grow mycelium from them and inoculate other morel favorable areas with liquid culture in hopes that the mycelium grown from these morels will then lack the lead arsenic contamination. Or perhaps just send them to a university with a mycology department for genetic sequencing and study, or something along those lines.
So now you understand that dying elm and ash trees, and specifically dying apple orchards, create environments that are conducive to morel growth. However, they are, because of bioremediation in the mushrooms, very oftentimes tainted. So the path that I took when discovering this is to explore just young forests that I could find in my local area, and whenever I found tulip trees, I found morels. So tulip trees are very distinct. They have these very beautiful flowers, and they have this very interesting shaped leaf. They're unmistakable. And let's just admire the beauty of the tulip tree for a second before we get to the next part of this video here.
As you know, it's the springtime in the Northeast here, and it is May 12th. This is prime morel season. This is when you should be looking. Maybe it's a little late, but definitely there are still morels popping up, and you're going to see that's a fact in a second. So there are definitely morels in this area. I'm going to show you them in just a bit. But what I have found is that while it's very easy to go to, for example, an apple orchard and find morels there, they're very often laden with chemicals from the era where they were treating these trees, these apple orchards, with lead arsenate. And it's just not really a challenge. And part of the fun of finding morels is the challenge. And a challenge that I've set for myself is just to habitually every season find them in forests, not in apple orchards that are, an artificial man-made environment. And one of the environments in which I find morels most frequently outside of the apple orchard is by wet areas near tulip trees. And I'm going to show you that this is the exact environment that I just referenced. So we have like a little babbling, I don't know if it's like a brook or something, very small body of water, but you can see that there's skunk cabbage growing all over the place. It's just like a little bridge here. I'll show you what we're dealing with here. Just a little bridge, nothing fancy, but a nice little area that I come to hike in every once in a while. So we're going to show you then that this is the area where I often find morels. And what you can see here, voila, is the tulip tree. They're these long, straight trunks that don't start branching until very, very high up in the trunk. And they have a distinct leaf shape, and I'm going to show you guys that. I'm going to try to show you guys that. But either way, let's see if we can zoom in on the leaf there. See if we can zoom in there. It's kind of hard to zoom in with my one hand on this. Let me see if I can. Okay, now. It's kind of hard to see the shape there, but you can see right here the shape of these tulip trees. And I'm going to intersperse some video of that so you can see it much closer. I obviously can't reach this, but we'll zoom back out here. We have another tulip tree right here, and you can see again how high they go up. Okay, I'm going to try to show you here. This is how high they go. They're extremely tall trees. Okay, and then if we just kind of take a walk over here real quick, we can see a couple baby morels here. They're just starting to pop out. See if I can get them here. There goes one right there. Okay, we'll zoom in on that. Okay, so there's one right there. There's another one right next to it. I'll try to zoom in on that right there. Let's see if we can change the exposure settings so you guys can see that a little bit more clearly. And there's also one way back over there. Okay. So these are the environments, the microenvironments that I think are most conducive to morel hunting in the mid to late season of morel season. Oh, I just spotted another one right over here. So this tree is definitely producing some morels here. Let me see if I can zoom in on this guy. Okay, right about here. Should be able to see it in a second. Let me see. There it is, right there. Okay, so you got another one, and they're just coming out of the ground. And so this is something that I always keep an eye out for. Tulip trees are precisely the environment that you want. And so we're gonna show you a little bit more of these trees here. But yeah, I mean, it's so important that we study the microenvironments that these mushrooms want. I'm gonna start documenting every plant species here, and I'm going to show, you know, maybe I'll email some botanists on YouTube and see how, if they respond, and see if maybe they can identify some of these plant species here. And then we'll get a picture of the tree associations and plant associations that is conducive to morel growth, at least in this instance. And then maybe we can start comparing it to other people's. So that's how we learn, and we're going to do that then.